Welcome back to the pursuit of progress, where real estate, economics, and self improvement collide. I'm Adam, and I'm here as always with my co host, Ben. And today we're going to dive into one of the most controversial pieces of legislation to hit the floor in years, what they're calling the Big Beautiful Bill. But after studying Ray Dalio's brand new book, it's called How Countries Go Broke, we can tell you this bill is anything but beautiful. It's a warning sign. It's a flashing red light for our economy. And in this episode, it's going to be pretty bold. It's going to be unapologetic, and we might ruffle some feathers. It's going to make some people uncomfortable because we're going to walk you through 11 brutal truths that Congress does not want you guys to know about. From inflation triggers to debt traps, from pork barrel spending to the collapse of currency trust, we're going to be breaking it all down today. So let's get right into it. Ben, what is up, man? I'm excited for you to really share a lot with our viewers and listeners today on this because I know this is something you're super passionate about. And I think you just finished this book in the last couple of weeks, right?
Yeah, I'm actually, this came out and it debuted on June 2nd. I'm still in the middle of reading it, but I've been doing a
Okay.
deep dive. I've really enjoyed reading it so much that I've bought some of Ray's other books. And one of the reasons I'm so intrigued by this is because for the longest time, even since I was a kid, I remember my teachers at school talking about the deficit and how much it was growing. And here we are, 30 years later, 2025, we have a record deficit. We have record debt, $34 trillion. And I'm like, when, when do the chickens come home to roost? What does that look like? When is that going to happen? And so he goes over all of this stuff, and it turns out that this is a normal part of the debt cycle. What's happening here in America right now, and it's exactly what's happening in American politics, how this bill is handled. It's all part of the big debt cycle.
And before we dive into these, just so anybody that maybe is not familiar with Ray, just give us a little bit of a background on Ray and who he is and why we should be taking his thoughts seriously.
Yeah, Ray is an author. He's an investor. He's someone who has a net worth of, I think, $20 billion. He manages one of the largest hedge funds in the world, but he's also a student of finance and a student of economies. And the reason that he wrote this book is because there is not a lot of literature or data or analysis on how countries go broke. And some of the opening chapters are on this. And the reason for that is because the debt cycle is usually anywhere from 80 to 100 to 120 years. So the debt cycle could be as long or longer than someone's entire life. And if you're living in that economic period, a lot of times you can't really observe fully what's happened. So in this book, he goes back and he looks at past global powers, superpowers, going back 500 years. And in every case, there are these common themes when it comes to the rise of the country, how they rise, their currency, and their debt, and they borrow more. When they borrow more initially, it's a positive thing because it allows for infrastructure, allows for growth and investment. The company can produce faster. But then as they borrow more debt, well, all of a sudden, interest expense becomes the largest expense. And that's almost where we're at here in the United States. In fact, it's projected that later this year, our interest expense on our debt will become our number one expense. And when that happens, that is very, very dangerous.
Yeah, just the interest is going to be what, like $500 million a year, maybe even more. Who knows? That's nuts.
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna outpace our defense spending, which I believe is several hundred billion.
Wow. Well, let's have you go ahead and just jump right into the quote of the week before we start sharing these 11 brutal truths.
Yeah, our quote of the week comes from Ray in this book, How Countries Go Broke. And this is what he shares on economic pain. When economic pain is not equally shared, societies fracture. That is how revolutions begin. That's not just theory. That's not just theory. It's happening in real time. This bill is a symptom of that fracture.
Very interesting. All right, well, let's just jump right now into it. The 11 brutal truths behind the big, beautiful bill. And we'll start right off with number one. There is a debt tsunami that is coming in and coming in fast. So this bill is actually going to be adding 2.4, 3.2 trillion to our already 34 trillion national debt, which is pretty insane. I know that, before we kind of dive into all 11 of these, Ben and I are both pretty, you know, we really respect and admire Elon Musk and what he's accomplished in his career. And I know he's been one of the most outspoken on, publicly talking about how he thinks this bill is garbage and is, I think, mainly because of this exact point, just how much additional debt we're adding when the whole point of Doge, the whole point of Trump getting reelected was to really get a lot of the finances in order in our country and start running it more like a business. And I agree with this one being a pretty scary, brutal truth about just a lot more debt coming if this does get passed. So, Ben, what do you think on this one?
Yeah, I mean, two and a half to $3.5 trillion to our $34 trillion national debt. We just touched on this a minute ago, but yeah, the interest costs are going to exceed our military spending later this year. Dalio refers to this stage of the debt cycle as the death spiral stage, where the empire begins to collapse. Now, just think about your personal budget. Think about all the debts and the obligations that you might have, mortgage and any other debts. With all of our revenue that we have as a country, we cannot even make our minimum payments with you know, all of the different debts and obligations that we have. And that is what is so concerning. Not only do we have the debt, which is outrageous, we're still operating at a deficit. So we have an outrageous albatross $34 trillion in total debt, but then our budget's not even breaking even. I mean, that's outrageous.
I should know this, but I don't. What's like a country like China? Are they in a significant debt as well with their national debt? Like, what's going on in other countries around the world? Is this something that we're really way below others on as far as just operating much, much more inefficiently?
Yeah, like right now, China is buying a lot of our debt. So they're in a
Hmm.
different phase of their own debt cycle. So they're growing, they're building out their country, they're investing. There's all sorts of infrastructure happening. So they are borrowing in a more responsible way because they're able to get returns that can then service the debt. And a lot of our growth happened after World War II when you look at our current debt cycle, but we have just never that's why it's so critical for us to get this back into balance as soon as we can. And Dalio has mentioned that if we don't, there is going to be a debt tsunami coming like nothing that we've ever seen before. All right. Truth number 2, credit rating chaos. Now, did you know that just like you, the individual, we all have personal credit scores? Did you know that the US also has a credit score? Well, our credit score was just downgraded. The United States credit score was just downgraded by Fitch and is now under threat with Moody's. When your credit score is downgraded, just like an individual, if you have a lower credit score, you're going to pay higher interest. It's going to be more expensive to, to pay your debt, to get qualified. So, same with the US. Higher borrowing costs equal more expensive everything. And ultimately, it's the American consumer that pays because our mortgage rates, for example, follow our 10-year treasury. And if interest rates go up because our credit rating goes down, well, mortgages, loans, credit cards for the individual American consumer is also going to be impacted. Dalio calls this the trust erosion phase. And it doesn't just impact the government and our debt and our credit rating, it also impacts the individual.
All right. So, truth number 3, home ownership just got a hell of a lot harder. So, these higher treasury yields definitely are, like Ben was just saying, driving up the mortgage rates. First time home buyers are a lot of the times the ones getting affected and hurt the most by this. Dalio talks about this is the wealth destruction phase now. So, Ben, I think you're a little bit more versed than I am on what Ray was specifically talking about here. But, just my 2 cents is again just how first time home buyers are really the ones being affected by this even more just due to the challenges that they're having with saving for their down payment, just all the other uncertainty that exists in the country and makes a lot of these home buyers that maybe it is their first time just not having the confidence to get into the game and just staying on the sidelines because of the uncertainty and just lack of maybe faith and confidence in the country and what we're going to be seeing in the future when it comes to rates and getting a home loan and being successful in real estate.
I think that's absolutely right. And to kind of refer back to the quote that we opened, when the economic pain is not equally shared, that is when societies fracture. And in cases like this, the reason that home ownership is getting harder, and the reason that he calls it the wealth destruction phase, is because it unproportionately impacts first time home buyers, the poor, and the middle class the most. Because uh, if you can't get into a home, for example, you're not going to have the opportunity to start building equity and get that solid financial foundation. You're not ultimately not going to be able to build wealth. So that's where it's not shared proportionally with where the wealthy, they already own the assets. And I think I read something, or I read the statistic that here in the next year, the 1%, 1% will have a higher net worth and have more assets than the entire middle class. The middle class, I think, is what, like 70% of the population, 60 to 70%, but the 1% will have more assets than the entire middle class. So that's where things are starting to, you hear some of these conversations about like redistribution of wealth. And I'm not a believer of that. We're a capitalist economy, but we do need to figure out ways that we can allow people to take advantages of the things that have made America strong, that have made us a powerhouse over hundreds of years. Truth number 4: inflation on steroids. Debt without productivity equals inflation. And this is the problem when we have these large deficits and this record debt. The Fed just can't raise rates fast enough to keep up. And this is also a late stage. This is how a lot of empires have declined. When your debt gets out of control, you got a couple different options. You can raise interest rates, that's not going to solve the problem. You can print more money, but that's going to devalue your currency. There's not a lot of real solutions unless you're actually producing. And that's the problem right now. When we're taking out debt just to service debt, we're taking out debt just to make payments on debt. We're not actually producing anything. Going back to your question a minute ago about China, China is taking debt out to go invest in its own infrastructure, to go develop its country. So that debt is actually going towards something positive. When the United States is taking out debt because of the stage and the debt cycle that we're in, and our debt has gotten so large, we're taking out debt just to make minimum payments on debt. We're not actually producing anything.
So crazy. Just the fact that it's like this elephant in the room, but just nobody takes it seriously. I just can't get over how this, just gets worse and worse and just doesn't seem like it's a priority even in our current administration after it was one of Trump's main, kind of selling points for people to get him in office again. I don't know. I know it's a lot more complicated than, it seems, but it sure is something that just does not seem to be at the top of the list. I don't know, just frustrating.
Yeah, and there is going to be a breaking point at some point, and it's going to be future generations. It could be a year from now, it could be 10 years from now, it could be 15 years from now, but it's going to be, if we're just kicking the can down the road, we're just kicking the problem down the road. That's all that we're doing. And I was having this conversation with my daughter a couple of nights ago. I think it's more challenging for our generation than it was our parents, as far as cost of education, as far as buying your first home. It is going to be way harder for this next generation than it was for even us. Kids that are in high school right now, job market, where wages are at with respect to the cost of education, home affordability prices, just the cost of living, so much more difficult.
So, truth number 5, a currency weakness alert. This is a major concern for a lot of people, and just kind of piggybacking off of the last couple truths that Ben and I were talking about. and the value of the dollar. I think some statistic recently was saying it was like 60% of what it used to be worth. I mean, there's just an insane amount of devaluation right now with the dollar. And that is not a good place to be. And this dollar dominance that we've had for decades is really starting to slip here in the US. And I think one easy way just to see this firsthand right now is just how a lot of the global lenders are diversifying away from the United States. And Dalio is very keen on this, and he talks about how currency confidence erodes gradually, but then it just hits all at once. Have you gotten into the book yet, Ben, where he kind of touches on this in more depth, or do you have anything to add?
Yeah, it's interesting because when it comes to currency confidence, when it comes to investor confidence, one of the things that he talks about is policymakers and leaders try and present everything in a way to the public, to investors, as if everything is fine. And we're still going to be able to kind of keep going. And that's what's been happening. That's what's been happening, and that's what's happening right now. But then you start to look at that budget and your expense line items start to change. And that's why it's always so concerning when the interest expense on the debt becomes your biggest expense, because that means that you can now no longer produce the same way that you were. And when you're having to do that, you're then having to issue more bonds, you're having to print more money. All of that starts to then devalue your currency. So all of this stuff is connected. And when the currency starts to get devalued, it happens slow, but then eventually, once you get to the cliff, like, you will fall off the cliff. And once things fall off the cliff, then at that point it gets really scary.
Yeah, I don't even want to think about that. That is scary. I think that would be a really good Hollywood movie. I'm surprised they haven't. Maybe they. I don't know. Have you seen any movies in the past that kind of have that as the theme of the movie, like a
You know,
hypothetical
there's not a
U.S.
lot of
just completely
financial
crashing?
movies out there. I know there was The Big Short that
Hmm.
kind of covered the 2008 2009, but I think there will be. We'll see how all of this shakes out and how it all unfolds. But the questions I'm constantly asking myself as a individual, as an investor, as a consumer: what can I do to just put myself in the best position possible to protect my investments, to protect my family? And so these are things that I think about quite a bit.
With that, we are going to now jump into our sponsored segment. So this week's sponsor is actually two companies that have aligned and are doing a ton of cool things right now. Today's episode is brought to you by our upcoming free live real estate masterclass with none other than Ben and myself, Adam Sells Denver and American Money 101. If you want real world strategies to build financial resilience in this chaotic market, don't miss this free live webinar. You can sign up at webinar.adamsellsdenver.com. And you guys, we're doing these every single month. We're continuing to get better and better at these. Our attendance is getting better. We're getting a lot of people that are really getting value out of these. And hopefully you can join us on the next one and we can connect and hopefully provide some value to you as well. So if you're a little bit concerned or just unsure, uncertain about what to do right now in this very unique market, this is a great opportunity for you to connect and learn a few tips and tactics that we're seeing our actual clients take advantage of and do in today's market to win. So hopefully we'll see you guys there.
All right, back at it. Truth number 6: tariff tax trap. Now, in this new bill, there's $200 billion in new tariffs. What we don't talk about, and what isn't talked about policymakers and with the media, is who is paying for these tariffs. A tariff is essentially a tax on another country, a premium. They pay more, but ultimately the consumer ends up paying for it because it just gets passed along. And if you go to some of my social media accounts, I've done a lot of consumer advocacy posts recently, and I shared one a couple of days ago where this restaurant was charging a 20%. I can't remember the exact line item that they charge. It was a living wage fee. That's how this specific restaurant described it. Ultimately, though, the actual and individual consumer is the one that ends up paying for all this stuff, whether it's tariffs, increased costs, supply chain issues. Companies aren't going to, they're not going to take the loss. They're going to raise prices. If they're having to pay a tax, they're going to raise their price. That then gets imported into the country, and then the American consumer then gets foots the bill there.
I'm going to push back on this one a little bit, though, because I think in the long term, there's still some value in this, just from a standpoint of yes, it is going to sting at first. It is going to be more expensive for us domestically here in the US as consumers. But hopefully, that's going to be enough of a sting and discomfort to motivate some of these companies to, instead of outsourcing a lot of their work overseas, hopefully, this will be, again, over time, start creating more jobs here in the USA and help internally kind of push us up from within with just more jobs, more locally, or at least I should say, domestically made products and services. The other big challenge that we're going to be facing too is just all the stuff with AI and how that's going to be eliminating so many jobs that I think this one is really going to be interesting to track and follow over the next few years, just with what countries are really embracing AI, which ones aren't, and just I think
Yeah.
some opportunities that different countries are going to have to really get ahead if they are first to market with some of these just changes that are inevitably going to happen, whether we like them or not.
He touches on this in the book as well. When a country also raises their standard of living, that's why it's attractive to outsource jobs. So when you think about the industrial revolution of America, going back to the 80s, and you think of Standard Oil and some of these other kind of big corporations that were getting their start, maybe Ford and the assembly line. Back then, people were working 70-hour weeks. And as the economy kind of matures through this debt cycle, the standard of living gets raised and individuals develop more rights, and they have more demands as far as their pay. And that's where like some of the unions and increased wages, minimum wages have come from. But in places like China or some of these other third world countries, because they're in a different cycle of their debt phase, their standard of living hasn't been raised the same way that it's been here. So people over there are still willing to work 12-hour days for a lot less compared to what we have here.
All right, let's do now number 7. Leaders are flying blind. So most policymakers, they just lack macroeconomic literacy. And Ben and I were venting about this actually earlier today about just how absurd it is where the people that are making these decisions and putting a lot of these policies in place have no absolute zero financial literacy, have no track record of balancing their own personal budgets, much less an entire nation. It just, I don't know, it just blows me away just how we're putting all of our fate into these people's hands that are definitely not the right ones to be making some of these decisions. I know, Ben, you're pretty passionate about that too. What's your 2 cents on that?
Yeah, I think this truth, number 7 and number 8, are the two most important because it highlights how flawed our decision and judgment making is when it comes to passing bills like this. And so we are relying, there's a difference between policy and a difference between budget. When you look at this bill, there's been a lot of outcry from individuals online, with this thing getting cut or this grant getting cut or this uh, public school no longer has the same funding that it did. I can understand why people would get upset if those specific things are getting cut out of the budget, but there's a difference between policy and budget. If there's not room in the budget, if you can't afford things, like things have to get cut. And so that's where even with this bill in Doge and having cut a lot of things out the last 3 or 4 months, bill is still projected to have a multi-trillion-dollar deficit. And the reason for that is because we are relying on policymakers who understand nothing about money, about budgets. They're completely financial illiterate, yet we are leaning on them to make these financial decisions, not just like, think of Apple, corporation that has $1 trillion plus net worth or capitalization rate there. Can you think of Apple like managing their company like this, where they just don't have any? They don't have any. The decisions are being made by people that don't actually understand money or budget or projections. That's what's happening right now in the United States. So our policymakers are coming up with the budget. The problem, though, is they don't understand any of this financially.
Crazy, man.
Truth number 8: monetary illiteracy accelerates decline. And so this really goes in line with number 7, but this is kind of what I've been harping on. Congress confuses debt expansion with growth. And so this bill is called the Big Beautiful Bill. It's this really, really big bill. But the number one line item from the bill is to pay our own debt. And so again, you have these other countries that are able to actually invest in themselves and infrastructure and do different things. A big portion of this bill is just servicing the own debt, our own debt that we already have. And so there's not as much growth. And when you have that, this accelerates decline. And Dalio warns this is how compounding mistakes happen. We have a record debt. We still have a record deficit. We're compounding on our mistakes. You've heard of compounding interest and how positive that is. This right here, we're compounding on our mistakes.
Yeah, it's definitely basically the path towards bankruptcy. I mean, you look at companies before they file bankruptcy, this is the stage that they're in, just this negative compounding and how near impossible it is to dig out from underneath that. And it's kind of where we're at right now, which is scary to think about.
Yeah, it is. It's just scary to think about what is that going to be like when, when everything.
So, truth number 9: false deficit claims. So, savings are projected, they're not real. Spending is immediate. And Dalio, talks about, I don't know how to even pronounce this word that he shared. Illusory? Ben, how would I say that
Illusory.
word?
Like an
Illusory.
illusion. Having a prosperity that is not based off of fact, it's based off of illusion.
Got it. Okay. Well, I kind of stumbled on this truth all from start to finish. How about you kind of pick up my slack and share this one a little bit better with them?
That's why it's always important to have third parties review these budgets because, it can be spun a certain way by politicians. But when you have some of these third parties look into it, independent economists, Elon Musk, others who don't have as much of a vested interest, they're able to give a little bit more of analysis. And that's where this is coming from, where, our politicians are propping this as there is a projected savings, but the reality is it's not real. It's just kind of projected. It's all, and the projected savings is always based off of tax cuts or things that are set to expire. That stuff is always extended.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how many times have we extended tax cuts? And so when someone talks about the savings that this is going to generate, it's assuming that all of that stuff will end as it's supposed to, but it never does. Um, and then the other problem is the spending piece of it. The savings is always what if or maybe. The spending is always right now. Doesn't it seem like we're having this conversation with Congress as far as getting the debt ceiling raised or getting these important financial bills passed every 3 to 6 months?
And what kills me is how these congressmen are basically just kicking the can down the road until their term is up, or a lot of times before reelection. It's like it's their top priority, but as soon as they actually, win their seat and they're back in office and they can kind of, breathe a little bit and they're not up against the chopping block, this goes from being the most important thing in the room to something that just gets kind of overlooked and I think avoided, which is just disgraceful in my opinion.
Yeah, when everyone puts themselves first or their constituents first and not the greater good of our economic health, nothing's going to change. And Dalio argues that it needs fundamental foundational restructure. And if that doesn't happen, it can't be resolved.
Mm-hmm. All
Truth
right.
number
How about
10.
truth number 10?
Yeah, let's do truth number 10. This bill hurts the struggling the most. So, and again, this bill has not been passed yet. It sounds like it's getting closer to being passed, but it's still in the legislative process. But when you have inflation and higher interest rates, which we've experienced a lot over the last 4 or 5 years, and we're still in the middle of. The hardest hit are the working class because affordability is an issue, cost of living is an issue, groceries are going up, rent becomes more expensive, getting qualified for a mortgage is more difficult. There's also proposed cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, other affordable housing measures. Dalio talks about when wealth gaps plus when you have wealth gaps and economic pain, it creates social unrest. And doesn't it feel like there's been a lot of social unrest here recently?
100%. That's what I was about to say. It's right now, exactly. Yep. Well, we're going to have to see what happens, man. Only time will tell. All right, guys. Last but not least, truth number 11, the pork barrel panic. Hundreds of millions in earmarks, campaign favors. There's just so much fat in a lot of this stuff. And it's just, again, another thing that just is so frustrating just to see politicians, congresspeople promise one thing and then deliver something completely different. I know, Ben, you're probably pretty passionate about this one. What 2 cents do you have on this one?
Yeah, I looked up a couple of the pork measures in the bill. So one of them, there was a $200 million transit study in a county that didn't have like a paved road. Yet there's a $200 million transit study in that specific county. There was also $450 million earmarked to build a museum in one of the policymakers' district. 450 million, and that's that. These are the recurring problems. Until this stuff is eliminated and cut out, like nothing is going to change. We talk about this a lot. If you want to change, you actually have to change. And if we're just going to keep, passing bills, legislation, and doing things the same way, nothing's going to change.
I really liked how Dalio put, declining empires spend politically, not productively. And that is exactly, I feel like, what's happening a lot. Not to go one side or the other politically, but I think it's funny how you see people like Nancy Pelosi and her net worth, 30 years plus, maybe even 40 years at this point in, public service. At the most, I think her annual salary was maybe 225,000, something like that, maybe 175, not that much. And she has a net worth today of, I think it was like $400 million. I just feel like a lot of these politicians with that absurd amount of net worth is because they've been the ones that have been earmarking and doing these campaign favors and just really benefiting themselves while putting this working class up against a wall and really hurting a lot of other Americans, hardworking Americans.
Yeah, I know it's and I feel the same way. I mean, when I think of America, I feel like we spend politically, not one side of the aisle or the other. I mean, we just spend politically, not productively. All right, well, we're just going to recap everything here. This bill isn't just flawed, it's dangerous. It hits nearly every red flag in Dalio's economic collapse playbook, and it's happening in plain sight. If this episode challenged what you've been told, that's the point. We're not here to play nice. We're here to wake up people. Hit subscribe, share this episode, and leave a comment if you're seeing the same warning signs we are. Remember, this isn't just about politics, it's about survival, financial truth, and taking action before it's too late. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and God bless America. God bless all of us.
God bless America. I wish I could have that amazing song, Take Us Home Tonight, take us off this episode. And a born to be an American. Well, I can't
Is that
sing. I don't
Toby
know the
Keith?
words. That was
Here we
Lee
go.
Greenwood.
Cue the music.
So good. Well, you guys, with that, we hope you have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week. And until next time, we'll see you then on an all new episode of the Pursuit of Progress podcast. We'll see you later.
See you guys next week.